Four issues. Issue number one, the imp of the perverse. The imp suggests what? I'm speaking both of the story, I suppose, as well as of the creature called the imp by the narrator. Well, we'll see what the imp suggests, but the issue is that of evil motive, is it not? It's all about, the story is all about why men do evil. We've mostly seen a lot of different motives, moving men, mostly men, to do evil things, to do bad things. But mostly they have been directed towards worldly rewards, not the negation thereof. Think of the Joker. Some men just want to watch the world burn. We'll explore this in the first play. Issue number two, Ligeia, horror women. She's pretty horrible, is she not? Especially upon her return. Women entering the conversation here, not as they used to be in the conversation, as the victims, the damsels in distress all too often, the Elizabeth Levenzas, correct? The Elenas, you remember these women in various novels and fictions that we have read before, the wife in the Black Cat, the victims of sufferers from male violence. Now the women with Poe, I think this is sustained by Eliot, and we're going to watch it as it develops over the course of the century. Women entering the conversation, the horror conversation, having turned from victims into victimizers. Do you think? I'll ask that question again when we get to the second issue and its treatment in the plates that follow. Issue number three, Bertha Gets Real, or Latimer does. Horror and realism, well, that's a bit abstract, that issue, although we're going to get into it very briefly. I wonder whether Latimer really is much of a realist. Nevertheless, let's not worry about that. We're not even going to worry about it later on all that much, but let's certainly not worry about it right now. Let's talk rather, let me just mention rather, a more familiar topic, horror and egoism, which we've seen before. More than once, have we not? I mean, we talked a lot about the egoism of, for example, Victor, correct? And I think we got into that topic as well, though it's a much more abstract sense in which Roderick Usher is an egoist. Issue number four, this will be very briefly treated in the plates that follow. Complexities in narrative form, the whys and wherefores of such. We've seen a lot of first-person narrators, haven't we? And you know what a first-person narrator it is. It's a narrator who speaks to you directly, says I, and is typically a part of the story, is involved in the action of the story. And a lot of the Poe stories have had first-person narrators. The Telltale Heart, the Cask of Amontillado, right? Ligeia, The Fall of the House of Usher, The Black Cat. So we've seen a lot of first-person narrators. Walton's letters, right, which give us the first-person narrative of Victor, who hands over, as it were, to Walton. The first-person narrative himself, in turn, gives over the first-person narrative of the monster, the creature. So there's a lot of first-person narrators, and you can sort of see how that might work, because horror seems to depend upon, does it not, right? An evocation of some horrid presence before you, the full apprehension of which, in a moment of horror, strikes you dumb. Nevertheless, people seem to find words. As frozen as they are, they can still speak, they can still think, and often it's, of course, recollected by these first-person narrators. You can sort of see how first-person narrative form might serve the ends of horror, might be very appropriate to evocations of horror, and it might be harder to do it in the third person. Third person is, of course, that more objective narrator who stands outside of the action, typically is not a part of the action, and is like telling you a story about another person, a second person, a third person, or is that third person who's not involved in the action, right? Of course, third person just means third person, he, she, or it is That's why, as opposed to you, which would be second person, or I in first person. So that's where the title comes from. Omniscience, if you've ever heard that word before, this all-knowingness that we um, tend to see so often in these third-person narratives, um, is interesting. How that is made. It seems to me George Eliot has something to say about that, and that's something to say about how omniscience itself can be very horror-making. Okay, we'll see when we get down below. Let's do it then. The spirit of perverseness. Now, that probably looks like a quote from The Imp of the Perverse, that story by Poe. It's actually a quote from The Black Cat, in which story Poe explores this exact same theme, even using the same term, which he unpacks, as it were, at greater length in the later story. But here's the line, a good line from The Black Cat that looks as though it could have been in The Imp of the Perverse. Who has not 100 times found himself committing a vile or stupid action for no other reason than because he knows he should not? Actually, from The Black Cat. And you know, the vile and stupid actions that he commits, knowing that he should not. The worst of which, of course, is the hanging of the cat, the gouging out of the cat's eye, and the killing of the wife, I believe, are more impulsive and less in reaction to this spirit, as it is called, the spirit of perverseness. Turning to the story, The Imp of the Perverse, the speaker holds forth, quote, I'm not more certain than I breathe, than that the assurance of the wrong or error of any action is often the one unconquerable force which impels us and alone impels us to its prosecution. Nor will this overwhelming tendency to do wrong for wrong's sake admit of analysis or resolution into ulterior elements. It is a radical, a primitive impulse, elementary, an innate and primitive principle of human action, a paradoxical something which we may call perverseness, for want of a more characteristic term. And this is the second time, as I mentioned before, that Poe calls it perverseness, or has one of his speakers do such. Now, Poe gives us 3 examples, as though we need any, right? I think we all get this, we all understand this, and we all perhaps could point to experiences in our own lives in which we obeyed the spirit of the perverse. But Poe gives us 3 examples, nevertheless. The first being, quote, the earnest desire to tantalize a listener by circumlocution. And he gives us that, you remember this example in which he the speaker speaks of a listener that he wants to impress, but he can't help it as he goes along. He understands at some level that if he misspeaks or he speaks clumsily or doesn't get to the point soon enough, circumlocution, that this will really irritate the listener, right? And Poe loves it. Poe develops the example, doesn't give us an actual event, right, that's narrated, but gives us a sketched out version of a situation in which you might even need to get something. You might even be asking for something when you tantalize the listener by circumlocution, but some perverse part of you, I don't know, maybe at some level doesn't want the thing, doesn't want to be beholden to the guy. Even that is sort of understandable. That's one of those up above that, we're one of those motives that admits of analysis or resolution into ulterior elements. You're not doing wrong simply for wrong's sake. You don't want to be beholden to the guy. Almost sounds like it's a little bit too much one of those ulterior elements that's sort of understandable. It isn't radical and primitive enough, this desire to do it simply because you, at some level, understand it's not the right thing to do. It's the wrong thing to do. Post second example, we have a task before us which must be speedily performed. Now, this one is of special relevance, I think, to students who have papers to write, right? Or professors who have papers to grade. We know that it will be ruinous to make delay. The most important crisis of our life calls trumpet-tongued for immediate energy and action. We glow, we are consumed with eagerness to commence the work. With the anticipation of whose glorious result, our whole souls are on fire. It shall be undertaken today. I'm going to start that darned paper. And yet we put it off until tomorrow. And why? Well, there is no answer, he says, except that we feel perverse. It's not because you really feel lazy. It's not because, the thought of sitting at the desk is just miserable to you. It isn't any one of the usual reasons. It is because you simply don't want to do that thing that you know to be the good thing to do. You want to do the reverse, and it's out of a spirit of pure self-frustration and uh, you know, again, it's primitive and so almost mysterious. This innate and primitive principle of human action, a paradoxical something. It's the very nature of paradox. You want to do the thing that seems most at odds with what is your own self-interest in that moment, right? There's no real good explanation for this, and that's what makes him have to resort to some of that language that he does up above. Well, what's his third example? That's the precipice. We peer into an abyss and we grow sick and dizzy. Our first impulse is to shrink from the danger. There arises in us a cloud of unnameable feeling, which assumes shape as did the vapor from the bottle out of which arose the genie, really the singular is genius, in the Arabian Nights, right? But out of this, our cloud upon the precipice edge, there grows into palpability a shape far more terrible than any genie or genius or any demon of a tale, and yet it is but a thought, although a fearful one, and one which chills the very marrow of our bones with the fierceness of the delight of its horror. And you recall what that is, which is the idea of throwing yourself off the edge of the cliff. Pretty vivid and dramatic example of the spirit of perverseness or the imp of the perverse. I think you would agree. I want to pull one element out here. So we begin now that we've worked through our examples to try to understand this a little bit more closely, right? Or at least place it. Far more terrible than any demon of a tale, says the speaker of the imp of the perverse, who, as it turns out, has his own little story to tell at the end. It looks like it's an essay on perverseness, but it turns into a story. Once we enter the 19th century after Radcliffe, I would argue the evil, and you can see it here, this whole notion of perverseness, the evil now turns gradually, sometimes partially or complicatedly. In other words, I don't know that we can just look at a sudden quick turn whereby the difference is just so vividly noticeable, except maybe with the imp of the perverse itself. The evil seems to have turned from an external demon or monster or monk into an impish thought, an idea or impulse, a desire originating inside us. So that's the big difference, is that the evil seems to come from inside rather than outside, right? I mean, in the case of Radcliffe, you just have to corral and corner and disable and disarm, or disarm and disable Schedoni, and you're going to be okay. And it's more or less the same with, right, with Walpole's, right, Manfred. But when we get to the 19th century, you know, it's almost as though when we get to a certain point in the 19th century here with Poe, it's as though, right, that the Schedoni's evil nature is something that you find cropping up, just sort of welling up from within yourself, strangely, in these impulses that you have that are kind of Schedoni-like impulses, right? And so it's, I mean, in a way you could chart it this way, that when we get into, but as we get further along in the 19th century, what we find, and you're going to see this vividly on display in a story like Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, where it's the good doctor, right? It's, I mean, it's Vivaldi. It's as if Vivaldi or Theodore, and we've already seen this with Victor. It's as though Vivaldi or Theodore, in a way with Victor, you know, is the evil one. The evil just sort of crops up inside a very, you know, an externally what would seem to be a very decent and good person, even a person who is undertaking these very important enterprises, either of heroism or heroism of one kind or another. I mean, look at what Victor, again, is a good example of this, because now you know, there we have a complicated example, don't we? Because I mean, we have an external demon. It's called the creature, the monster, right? But you will recall that the monster almost seems to be an externalization of desires in Victor himself, which are very, you know, not very friendly to his family, to his intended Elizabeth, and to his mother, as we've seen by looking at the dream, as we did, as some of you did. So, and as I think we did as a class by way of the last video, I believe. So I mean, you can see how this might work, you know. And I mean, there we have a complicated version of it. But if you, I mean, Victor in some ways is kind of like the Vivaldi, right? His good buddy, as it were, that he finds up in the Arctic, strangely enough, is Walton. And Walton really does come across as like one of those naive young chivalric, knightly, you know, the decency that he exhibits towards his sister and whatnot. There's no woman up there, damsel in distress, for him to say. Nevertheless, he reminds us of the Theos and the Vivaldis, and he is one step away from Victor and shares Victor's impulses and desires and whatnot, you might recall. They're not in the sick, I don't think they have the sick origin that they have in the case of Victor, but he's sort of our bridge back to the 18th century. We get there by way of Walton, right? It's almost as though he's Vivaldi taken into a 19th century novel. What would he wouldn't be a knight, he might be one of these travelers, one of these voyagers, right? During the great age of exploration. And well, that started earlier, but nevertheless, that's, you know, that kind of adventure narrative is sustained by Shelley in the form of Walton's quest, right? So we're one step away, we get to Victor. Now, Victor, transitional figure in a way, isn't he? Because, you know, he's not quite himself the monster. We have an external monster, but he's certainly not Vivaldi either. So but he's close to Vivaldi. It's not like he's not a Vivaldi, and it's not like he's not a monster. He's sort of a transitional figure who mediates between these two extremes. So he's a good example of, you know, again, a complicated case of this thing that we're talking about, right? But when we get to Poe, we actually have Vivaldi himself, as it were, Theo himself, Walton himself, you know, and Victor himself. If we just forget for a moment, if the monster was just terrible things that Victor himself did, okay, all the things done by the monster is almost an alter ego of Victor, as we were saying. You have it worked out there, but it's more like, you know, it's not as, you know, it's got to be done symbolically in that story. Whereas when you get to a Poe story, you actually have the victors of the world doing the nasty things themselves, okay? Even though they're still sort of like Vivaldi and like Walton and like Victor in his better moments. They've got that decency and goodness in them. They also have the evil in them that comes out. So what's the upshot of all this? In the 19th century, we find called into question, I would argue, and this to put it fairly abstractly, fairly generally, but I also think quite accurately, by way of horror literature, not that horror literature is the only kind of cultural enterprise going on at that time that does this. There are others in philosophy and science and what have you. But in the 19th century, we find called into question by way of horror literature, the Enlightenment or Age of Reason concept of the human as an essentially rational creature. As it turns out that your average, essentially, who you thought essentially rational human being begins to be depicted in the 19th century as containing all manner of potential for irrational, you know, what we'd sometimes call evil, irrational passion, desire, wish, need, impulse, ideas, all these things that we don't tend to associate with rational and with decent people, right? The 19th century began to explore us all, you know, your average person, your average Joe and Jill, as having this interior that was, you know, had a certain darkness in it. And I think this is very significant and shows us something that's very worthwhile in the study of the kind of material that we're now looking at. But we have more to do on this video than for me to carry on in that direction. So let's move on. Issue number 2. Well, for a moment, issue 1B, I ran out of space on the previous plate. Issue 1B, upshot number 2. We just spoke of how external demons fought by good men are becoming internal desires that they must abide. External demons fought by good men in the 18th century novel become, over the course of the 19th century novel, internal desires that these same good men must abide. That was the point we just made, and that is the point of issue 1. Paul helps us to see this transition. I think we also mentioned this in the past plate. Here's 1B. He also helps us to see how the desires I just spoke of change from wanting something in the world, Schedoni's desire for a high place, Manfred's desire for family dominion, these desires for something in the world, some position in the world, some object in the world, right? Some status or some material possession or what have you. Those desires of the evil folks in the 18th century novel change. And they change to the desire for not just something in the world, but for the whole world. you know, and we talked a little bit about that with Victor and his oceanic feeling, right, which is an old Freudian concept, but his desire to be the center of the whole world and have the whole world dependent upon him, and to be, in some ways, to shoulder aside the God of the Old Testament, the Christian God, and kind of remake the world, remake humanity, as much of it as he can at any rate, right? And to have a whole new race greet him as their creator is one of his original desires, right? That's a little bit more than like Schedoni, simply wanting a high position in the church and wanting, kind of his vanity and his pride, wanting these things that would distinguish him from others. Okay, Victor sort of doesn't so much want to be distinguished from others as he wants to be, he wants the others to all be like a part of him, like all to owe him, and all to be, as it were, so far beneath him that he was the God that they worship, right? That's a little bit different from just wanting to be first in line. Okay, well, let's call that a kind of, infinite desire. I'm about to do that down below, right? This change, this transition from wanting a position in the world to what Victor would seem to want, right? Which is to want the whole world, not just something in it, right? So this kind of huge expansion in the desire of the evil person, right? Or wanting, and this is where things get really twisted, indeed, wanting to destroy the world. I see this as something that post-perverse men kind of finally want. What they want is not just something different from what they want, what they seem to want, and the opposite of it, so that it's the imp of the perverse. I think at the heart of the impish desire to want the opposite of what's good for you is to want the opposite of what's good for you and the world, to want the opposite of the world, to want not world, to want the world to go away. Okay. Victor, to the extent that he's given over to the death drive and seems to be driven by a kind of fascination with or desire for death itself by way of psychoanalytically. I'm not going to go and reconstruct that right now, but if we look at the dream, we see some evidence of that, right? Where, Elizabeth turns into the mother who is in her grave. He almost seems to want to enter the grave himself somehow. It seems symbolically indicated in that moment. Roderick Usher, at some level, seems to be delighted when everything comes crashing down. Anyway, we could work back through those stories. We don't really have time right now, but I would suggest that at the heart of impish desire, the perverseness that we see, which is defined in The Imp of the Perverse as well as in some other tales by Poe we have seen, is this kind of global negation and this desire for not so much for something in the world, for the whole world itself, but a desire for the whole world to go away. Okay, so let's break this down. Number one, the irrational rives within us all. That's issue one. That's the answer to that issue. The answer to issue two, 1b, is that the irrational, so writhing, right, is infinitely irrational. The Joker doesn't want to see Gotham burn. He doesn't want to see just Gotham burn. He wants to see the world. He wants to see the world burn, all of it. Okay, moving on finally to issue number two, which is going to be treated a little bit on the next plate as well. Poe's women. For Poe, they won't stay alive, and they won't stay dead. I want to just read you something that was written by a wonderful critic named J. Gerald Kennedy about what happens, okay, in Ligeia, right? Virtually imprisoning the Lady Rowena in the bridal chamber within his isolated abbey, the narrator of Ligeia ends up as a madman in the attic, the captive not only of his own imagination, but of the two women in his life, who effectively conspire or cooperate with one another to produce a hideous drama of revivification, and to construct vivification, I get that right the first time, and to reconstruct themselves in the form of a single, terrifying female body with the power to paralyze and chill him into stone. Well, there's a lot of good stuff there in the Kennedy quote that kind of harkens back to some things that have been said, maybe even some things that are going to be said. I want to call your attention to one element of what Kennedy has to say in this moment, right? Which is this business about femininity, a terrifying female body, right? Women, or the two women become one woman, oddly, at the end of the story. It takes two women to take him down. It's true, but the point is that he's being taken down. Okay. Now you could see the ending is actually a happy ending, but if it's true to Poe's form, what typically happens at the end of these stories is not very good for the guy for whom women won't stay alive and won't stay dead, right? You think, of course, of Roderick Usher in the Fall of the House of Usher. And I realize Ligeia might be an outlier with respect to the final ending. He wrote a bunch of other stories as well, in which it wasn't really very good for him what happens at the end for the narrator of the story, when the woman he has wanted, who is lost, he is lost, and whom he has wanted, who has died and whom he has wished could come back, when she finally does come back, it typically results in his death. Now, we don't see that at the end of Ligeia, but we do see him frozen with fear. And there isn't a lot of, narration at the end of the story as to what a wonderful, uplifting experience this is. But in any event, I realize that is a more complicated ending than we get in a lot of these other stories. The larger pattern is such that women suddenly, do they not seem to be, something other than a damsel in distress? They become the monsters, is the simplest way to put this. And this is going to be developed a little bit in the next play when we begin to talk about Bertha from, you see the logic of the syllabus, Bertha from Eliot's story. And wait till we get to Carmilla in the story to follow, which is next week, and which is also a novella. And what you're going to find in Carmilla, who is a vampire, is that the first vampire in the English tradition is actually a woman. Okay, and I think that's very significant. It's significant for a number of reasons, but the one particular significance I would like us to pay attention to right now is simply this, that women are capable of being vampires, as it turns out, right? Women are capable of being monsters. And this is something that happens at a certain point in the tradition. It's extremely difficult to imagine in one of those 18th century novels any woman being, capable of the kind of misconduct, to put it courteously, we find committed by the Manfreds and the Scadonis. Issue 3, the reality of it is, it's horrible. But what's it? Well, of course, as we will find, it is Eliot's Bertha. She's the one, really. She's as bad as Ligeia, as Madeline, as any of those women, Morella, Eleonora, or Berenice, who arise literally from the dead at a certain time in Poe's career and begin to dominate his stories. Remember the lost Lenore and the Raven's one word, nevermore. These stories reverse that horrible final departure and loss with an equally all too horrible return, one which typically proves fatal to the bereft, passionate man. And maybe this is a bit of a surprise. A bit of a surprise to you is that I could put this character, Bertha, character from Eliot, if you've read Eliot before, didn't write a lot of horror, George Eliot, but this character, Bertha, that she would fit in with these horror matrons and maids, Ligeia, Madeline, Morella, Eleonora. I know we only read about Madeline and Ligeia. Trust me, the Morellas and the Berenices are of a part, right? And what we see in those stories, of course, by Poe, as I've just mentioned, in the previous plates, in the previous issues, right, is a reversal of the plot of The Raven, right, where Nevermore turns into a kind of horrible Evermore, right? You can imagine Ligeia never dying when she's arisen from the dead. Well, Bertha, again, back to Bertha. Does she really fit in with these characters out of Poe? You read the story. What do you think? Right? Is she, that is, or is it really one of them? To be sure, Bertha doesn't come back from the dead. She's no Ligeia in that sense. Then, there's a possibility that there's another way to be horrible, which is never to really be alive to begin with. There are two kinds of walking dead on this view, right? Those who are the undead who arise from the dead, having died, and walk amongst us. What about those who were never dead to begin with? Sorry, never alive to begin with, and who walk amongst us, and therefore also deserve that title, the walking dead. Bertha in the latter category? Well, no maybes about it. She occasions horror, at least to Latimer. Walking down, quote, the broad stone steps of the Grand Terrace in Prague, Latimer feels, quote, an arm slipped within his and a light hand gently pressing his wrist. And it is a, quote, moment of hell. In this moment, he foresees a future moment, you will recall, in which they will be married, he and Bertha. And he will suddenly, quote, and he suddenly sees into her pitiless soul, sees its barren worldliness, its scorching hate. No, I had that right the first time. He imagines a future time when he will have that experience of seeing into her pitiless soul. Accordingly, he shudders, feeling helpless before her, as if she clutched his bleeding heart. Now, this scene leaves, it's complex, right, as I've stumbled around a little bit there in its complex, complicated ground myself a moment ago. Right? The gist of it is that he's having this vision in this moment of a future vision, okay, in which he will, it's that complicated, right, in which he will, in fact, perceive what, we're going to see this as we continue on, the fact and truth about Bertha. And we're going to get into this paradox that the fact and truth about Bertha seem to be, there seems to be this aesthetic, this artistic vision that is part of his discovery of the truth, is involved in his discovery of the truth about her, which is a little paradoxical, but because we tend to think of that as creative and kind of subjective, right, as opposed to just looking and seeing an obvious truth right there before you, as plain as the nose on your face or on her face. In any event, press on. This scene leaves Latimer, right? The scene in which he has this intuition a future intuition of her nature. This scene leaves him with a repellent intimation, with this really disgusting sense of the serpentine, like snakes. Like when he thinks about Bertha, he thinks about snakes. Quote, the green serpent with the diamond eyes remaining a dark image on the retina. That sticks with him, it won't leave him. This sense of her as this kind of gorgeous, elegant snake, but just as fatal, just as dangerous as a snake. Yes, we're now in the femme fatale part of the semester, as you can see even next week when we get to Carmela. But that's, I've got something to say about that at the end of the video. Press on. When that future moment of insight into Bertha finally arrives for real, as it does in chapter 2 on the evening of the day in which Latimer's father dies, right? He, just as he predicted earlier, he suffers a terrible moment of complete illumination. By the way, I wish Eliot had said horrible moment, because it seems to be more a moment of horror than terror, but let's press on. Quote, the darkness, usually this is the vision. This is the moment of insight. The darkness usually surrounding Bertha and Bertha only. Remember, she's the only one that he can't really see into early on in the story. But the darkness lifts, right? The darkness had hidden out, and when it lifts, what he discovers when he can actually see is that the darkness had not hidden a landscape from him. He discovers, when the darkness lifts and he can see, only a blank prosaic wall. That's what's inside her. And this is an unusual moment of horror, in our books, right? Because normally when you have a horrible thing before you, it's something that's sort of grotesque and disturbing. But this is kind of, in a sense, grotesque. It's certainly very disturbing when you discover within the person you love, or imagine that at this point he actually is in love with her and is actually, right, this is the actual moment where they've, right, they're together. And what does he discover? But that she's got nothing within her. There's an emptiness there that's somehow as scary as any snake would have been, any green snake, which is such as he saw before. The veil finally lifted. Think of the title, The Lifted Veil. Gone is the exotic image of the green serpent, gone the landscape in which it might have moved, right? Only to be replaced by the sight of a narrow room in which nothing lives, its occupants being petty artifice in mere negation. That's the truth about her, is she's just a lot of little tricks. And she just kind of, everybody she has any contact with, you may have had friends like this. You end up ending the friendship because you feel that your friend is, is just very false. And to the extent that she ever accomplishes anything, I mean, it's a terrible thing. I hope none of our friends is ever exactly the truth about any of our friends, that, when they're not being false, and maybe sometimes even when they are being false, whenever they accomplish anything by way of their falsity, it's just to kill something, to thwart, to frustrate. And this is like somebody that who's maybe not a very constructive presence in your life. In any event, this is perhaps this kind of little prosaic vision he has of emptiness and blankness, and just this kind of wall that frustrates, right? Negates. This is perhaps the most horrible moment in the book. And I think a lot worse than that image of the green snake, right? Finally, Bertha is indeed revealed as it. This is my joke about it up above. Could we call her she who does not appear to be truly alive, but who nonetheless plots and schemes and hates? The undead. Well, she's not the undead in the sense of the once dead arisen and walking, like a zombie. But she's the walking dead nonetheless, as I began the plate by saying, because she's the hollow woman, she of the barren wall, who walks around doing human living things, right? But who's never truly been alive. But is that all there is to it? Is that all there is to it? Isn't Latimer himself pretty horrible too? Isn't it the case that it isn't just Bertha who is horrible? Latimer too emerges as horrible, if not instead. For Bertha gets real and is exposed as horrible, you will recall, only when Latimer does. Only when Latimer chucks romance, eliding or at least eluding for the moment. Maybe it cannot be elided, excised, eradicated, gotten rid of. His own, quote, growing passion for her, what he later describes as his wild poet's passion. Now, that would appear to be just fine, we denizens of Spring 2021, Horror 110. Well, we know all about the dangers of unbridled passion, ladies and gentlemen, don't we? Right? This is one of those early issues that arose in the discussion even of Radcliffe, and continued when we got to Victor, who has a kind of passion that he cannot seem to escape, that arises very early in his life. But there's something odd about Latimer's anti-romantic moments of realism. In fact, those moments when he seems to escape passion, right, and seems to be move beyond it into touch with the real. Right, there's something a little bit odd about those moments when he seems to have done such a thing, right, and become the good realist who has corralled or contained his passion, which gets people into trouble, as we know from Vivaldi and others. Right, then those moments that he does have where they're reported, aren't they, on page 19, for example. He speaks of measured fact, and he brags about on page 18, his super-added consciousness of the actual, and speaks of this as a gift, his ability to get into touch with the actual and the real and the measured. Calls it his unhappy gift of insight. He can get real, that's his claim. Right? Note how his getting real would appear to depend, though, on his exercising the very same poetic, aesthetic, romantic, yes, romantic with a big R, even passionate, sensibility that he must elude. That is, paradoxically, he gets real with respect to Bertha. If we read the book very carefully, read the novella carefully, there's moments when he gets real, sees the real Bertha, perceives the real interior beneath the charming, playful exterior. Remember those moments, those precise moments when he has this kind of experience of the real. They occur only after, in this case, for example, looking at length at Giorgione's picture of the cruel-eyed woman. See it over there to your right. Said to be a likeness of Lucretia Borgia. His prevision of Bertha's pitiless soul, then, follows upon aesthetic contemplation of that, quote, cunning, relentless face in the painting. The terrible reality, again, reality of the former depends on this experience of the terrible unreality of the latter. You get this, right? His access to the real seems to be provided by an experience of something that's wildly, passionately unreal. Similar, this is kind of paradoxical. Similarly, he faints upon meeting the real Bertha, only after first picturing, or as he would put it, previsioning her as the water nixie of myth, that pale, fatal-eyed woman. His, quote, mind being full of German lyrics, which are wildly romantic and passionate. It's his mind being full of German lyrics that immediately precedes this experience of fact. You see the paradox here. His facts are mediated. He's given access to the facts only by contact with aesthetic experience. They could be said to be themselves aesthetic artifacts. The facts are artifacts. See this? It's not just a play on words, right? His approach to the fact is by way of the artifact. His unrivaled grasp of the real depends on his poet's nature, as he calls it on page 10. So you see that paradox. He can escape fatal passion, fatal romance, only by means of romance, passion. It's quite a paradox. But perhaps, there's always a but and there's always a perhaps. The paradox is more apparent than real. Is Latimer's love for Bertha, in truth, a wild poet's passion? Is it not mediated by lots of things, chief amongst which I will mention his hatred of his brother, his jealousy of his brother? In the days following that horrifying premarital vision of married life with Bertha, Latimer experiences a, quote, wild, hell-braving joy that Bertha was to be mine. This, despite, quote, shuddering with horror as the vision of her true nature recurs to him. Latimer reports suffering a sense of thirst for Bertha that renders his, quote, fear of her poison feeble, a, quote, force of present emotion against which the vision, quote, has no more than the force of an idea. How so? May the answer be found in how he defines that, quote, present emotion. It is the emotion, quote, of my love for Bertha, of my dislike and jealousy towards my brother. That's on page 20. Note how Latimer pairs his love for the one with his jealousy of the other. I don't think that's any accident. As though the two were evil twins. Is it that Latimer loves and wants Bertha and therefore hates his brother, her seeming lover, because he's in the way? Or is it that he hates his brother and therefore wants and loves Bertha, his brother's intended, because she's a means, you get it, she's a means of in fact triumphing over the brother if he can somehow win her? We will perhaps take up this question and all that it involves and entails in our class discussion tomorrow. Latimer himself offers a little essay on egoism, just after making a somewhat outrageous plea for our sympathy. I believe egoism would be a good term for that which he suffers on this particular reading. Latimer's comfortable with these moral and emotional terms at any rate, and we should be too. Provisionally, not previsionally, however, we may say that maybe that's it. That's the horrible thing that happens, the horrible thing that exists. The egoist's failure to reach out. The egoist himself, in himself, unto himself, being nothing but himself, nothing but self, so help him. A subsidiary Eleatic horror. The perversion of the poetic, the aesthetic, the visionary, as the instrument of cold, clinical knowing beyond, quote, human piety. Cold as ice, as science, which of course is the ending of the book, the ending of the novella, or certainly has something to do with it. Issue number 2, complexities in narrative form, the wherefores of such. You have noticed this, and we will talk about this, and in fact, I'm not going to keep you much longer here in this video. Just wanted to point out a certain complexity and narrative that we have in seemingly the most traditional and unexceptional of the narratives that we've been reading lately, which is, of course, The Lifted Veil. And what I would like to suggest to you, and I'll let you read through the next two panels on your own, is that Latimer, okay, as you'll see in the next panel, clearly a first-person narrator, right? Nevertheless, seems to, in a sense, embody this kind of narrative alternative of omniscience that is so often associated with the Victorian novel, especially those Victorian novels which are narrated in the third person, okay? So I want to suggest that here in a relatively traditional, seemingly straightforward episode of narrative, such as we have in The Lifted Veil, I actually think we have a complex little wrinkle here, to the extent that the book seems to be, or the novella seems to be, a kind of study of or in omniscience. We'll explain this a little further, and we'll explore this a little further tomorrow, I expect. So I'll leave it as a kind of teasing, perhaps. I'm hoping it teases you out of thought or into thought. Part of this little video for now, and I will see you tomorrow.